The Kethvarun had been mapping the outer spiral arm for 11 cycles when they first detected the anomaly. It wasn't a distress signal. It wasn't a beacon. It was something far more unsettling, a vessel moving through deep space with absolute deliberate silence, broadcasting nothing, radiating only the faint thermal signature of a functional drive system. Fleet scanner Cast Sol logged the contact at 4:22 ship time and spent 3 full minutes cross-referencing the signature against every known configuration in the Conclave's registry before doing something she had never done in 14 years of active survey duty. She called the Admiral. Fleet Commander Aveth. Her voice was careful, stripped of the interpretive inflection her species used to signal emotional context. That alone told Aveth everything. I have an unregistered contact bearing 27 Mark 9. The vessel does not match any Conclave member profile. It does not match any client species. It does not match any catalogued pre-Conclave remnant design. Aveth crossed the bridge in 4 long strides. The scan display pulsed with a slow amber warning, the universal indicator for unresolved classification. The ship appeared as a dense geometric shape, angular and heavy, its silhouette suggesting mass far beyond what its drive signature implied. Active or dormant? Aveth asked. Active. The drive is running. The vessel is on a deliberate heading. It is not drifting. Sol zoomed the display. But it is not transmitting. No identification pulse. No greeting protocol. No navigation warning. It is moving through one of the busiest shipping transit corridors in this sector, and it is doing so in complete radio silence. Aveth studied the shape on the screen. In 1,200 years of recorded Conclave expansion, every species they had ever encountered, every single one, had responded to a proximity hail within 40 seconds. It was not a cultural universal. It was a survival instinct. When another ship appeared nearby in the void, you identified yourself. You exchanged intent. You made clear you were not a threat. This vessel had been within hailing range for 19 minutes. Send the standard first contact greeting sequence, Aveth said. All 6 frequency bands. Conclave standard, plus the mathematical primer. Already sent. Twice. Sol's secondary hands moved across her console. On initial detection and again 4 minutes ago. And? Nothing. The vessel has not altered course. It has not changed speed. It has not acknowledged our presence in any way. Aveth straightened. The bridge crew had gone quiet in that particular way that happened when professionals encountered something outside the edge of their training. How large is it? He asked. Sol hesitated. The hesitation itself was unusual. She was not the kind of officer who hesitated on simple measurements. That depends on which readings I trust, she said carefully. Optical puts it at approximately 400 meters. Density scans suggest something in the range of 90,000 tons displacement. But the drive output we're reading is consistent with something a third that mass and the power signature. She paused again. The power signature is inconsistent. It spikes in a pattern I cannot match to any known propulsion or weapon system. Whatever is running on that ship is running on a cycle we haven't seen before. Aveth looked at the shape on the screen for a long time. Get me a visual, he said finally. The long-range optics resolved the vessel slowly, working against distance and the sparse light of the outer spiral. What emerged was not what any of them had expected. The ship was dark. Not the passive dark of an unpowered hull, but a specific design darkness. Its hull coated in something that absorbed the ambient starlight around it rather than reflecting it. The geometry was angular, brutal, and asymmetrical in ways that seemed intentional rather than structural. It had no running lights. No position beacons. It wore the deep black of space like a coat, and if you didn't know exactly where to look, you would not see it at all. Is it armed? Asked Tactical Officer Sethvar, who had been silent until now. I can't tell, Sol said. Scan penetration is minimal. The hull composition is scattering our sensor array. I'm getting partial returns, inconsistent, fragmented. Whatever that hull is made of, it is not a standard alloy. It is not ceramic composite. It is not anything I can identify from the scatter pattern. So we cannot scan it. Not effectively. No. Sethvar turned to the Admiral. A vessel traveling under radio silence, on a deliberate heading through a major transit corridor, with a hull that defeats passive scanning, carrying power signatures we cannot identify. He let the description sit in the air for a moment. That is not a science vessel, Fleet Commander. Aveth knew that. He had known it since the first amber warning. Send a final hail, he said. Direct beam, maximum power, in the mathematical prime sequence. If they have any sensor array capable of detecting an incoming signal, they will receive it. The hail went out. For 11 seconds nothing happened. Then the dark ship's bearing shifted. A small, precise adjustment, not evasive, not aggressive. Deliberate. It turned toward the Kethvarun fleet. And then a single signal came back. Not on any of the 6 standard frequencies. Not on the mathematical primer band. On a frequency so far outside normal operating range that the computer had to flag it 3 times before the comm station recognized it as intentional. It was not a greeting. It was not identification. It was a single, sustained tone of a specific mathematical frequency, held for exactly 3 seconds, then cut. Irith Sol stared at her console. That tone, she said slowly, is the square root of 2. Expressed as a radio frequency. The bridge was very quiet. They heard us, Aveth said. They are telling us they heard us. He looked at the vessel on the display, dark and enormous and patient. And they are choosing not to say anything more. Sethvar spoke quietly. What do we do? Aveth did not answer immediately. He was looking at the ship, at its deliberate course, its designed invisibility, its immense and measured stillness. Everything about it was intentional. Every choice it had made since entering sensor range had been intentional. We do not approach, he said at last. We do not attempt to intercept. We log this contact and we relay everything we have to the Conclave Science Directorate and the Defense Assembly, simultaneously. He paused. And we keep watching. The dark ship continued on its heading, unhurried, as if the fleet of 12 Kethvarun vessels arranged across its path was a mild inconvenience it had already decided how to handle. It would be 3 hours before they attempted an active scan. They would spend the next 6 months trying to understand what the scan returned. The decision to conduct an active scan of the unidentified vessel was not made lightly. Within the Kethvarun Defense Fleet, active scanning of an unknown contact was a formal act. The equivalent in older diplomatic language of pointing a weapon to ask a question. It declared intent. It declared capability. It told the scanned vessel, we are looking inside you and we have the power to do so whether you consent or not. Admiral Aveth convened a command council. 3 hours had passed since the dark ship had responded to their mathematical hail with a single tone and then returned to silence. In those 3 hours it had neither accelerated nor slowed, neither altered course nor made any further transmission. It had simply continued moving, deliberate, enormous and patient, while 12 Kethvarun survey and escort vessels held formation around it at a cautious distance. The Conclave Science Directorate wants data, said Deputy Commander Rathlin, reading from the relay. They want hull composition, internal layout, crew count if detectable, power source classification and weapons assessment. The Defense Assembly wants something simpler, said Sethvar. They want to know if it can kill us. Both are reasonable requests, Aveth said. Can we conduct an active scan without provoking a response we aren't prepared for? Irith Sol pulled up her analysis on the main display. The passive data we have suggests the hull material significantly degrades our sensor return. An active scan, full spectrum, maximum array output, should penetrate further. But I cannot promise complete data. The scatter pattern from their hull is unlike anything in our reference library. She pointed to a series of waveform charts on her secondary screen. Whatever they coded it with, it behaves differently at different scan frequencies. Some wavelengths are almost completely absorbed. Others are bounced back so precisely that they appear to have been intentionally redirected. Intentionally? Rathlin repeated. I cannot confirm that. But the pattern is too consistent to be random material behavior. It would require an alloy or composite with extraordinarily specific electromagnetic properties that would need to be engineered. This is not a hull designed merely for structural integrity or thermal management. It is a hull designed to be difficult to read. That landed in the council chamber and stayed there. A hull designed to be difficult to scan was not a science vessel. It was not a freighter. It was not a diplomatic courier. It was a warship. Or something that wanted to be treated like one. Proceed with the active scan, Aveth ordered. Full spectrum but staged, low power first, escalating only if the initial returns are insufficient. And I want our defensive screens at full readiness before the first pulse goes out. The scan sequence took 9 minutes to prepare. When it fired, the active sensor array of the Kethvarun survey flagship, one of the most sophisticated scanner platforms deployed in the outer spiral, reached out across 8,000 kilometers of vacuum and tried to read the dark ship the way you would read a book. What came back was something closer to a locked vault. Irith Sol worked the returns in silence for almost 4 minutes before speaking. Around her, the bridge crew watched her face and tried to interpret what her expression wasn't showing them. "Hull penetration is approximately 40%, she said finally. "We are reading through parts of the outer skin, but the interior is heavily shielded. There are compartments we cannot image at all. The shielding appears to be layered, each layer using a different composition, as if designed specifically to defeat multiple scan types in sequence." "What can we confirm?" Aveth asked. "Massachusetts. We can confirm mass. The vessel displaces between 85 and 92,000 tons, depending on how we account for the scan dark areas." She brought up the partial imaging. The shape that resolved on the display was incomplete. A ghost ship rendered in fragments, some sections clear, others entirely absent from the data. "We can confirm the drive system is functional and the power output is substantial, though the energy profile is still anomalous. And we can confirm," she stopped. "Irith Soul. We can confirm the presence of biological life signs." She turned from her console. "Multiple. Distributed throughout the vessel in patterns consistent with active crewing. We detected at least 240 individual biological signatures. Possibly more in the scan dark areas. Species identification? Impossible at this resolution." She paused. "But the biological readings are consistent with a carbon-based, oxygen-metabolizing species. Medium to large size relative to Kethvarun's standard. And their environmental controls are running warm. Slightly above what we maintain, slightly above conclave norm. Their preferred atmosphere is standard nitrogen-oxygen ratio, very close to our own." Sethvar leaned forward. "That narrows the candidate pool considerably." "It eliminates most of the registered conclave species, yes," Irith Soul said. "But that was already true from the ship's design and behavior. This vessel does not belong to anyone we know." The partial image of the dark ship rotated slowly on the main display, its missing sections rendered in gray inference fill. What you could see was angular, dense and purposeful. The weapon systems, if they were weapon systems, appeared as clusters of long parallel structures along the ventral hull, covered in the same scan-resistant material as the rest of the ship. They could have been sensor arrays. They could have been railgun assemblies. The scan data was insufficient to be sure. But then Irith Soul flagged something in the high-resolution optical data that the scan had also captured. There, on the aft section of the hull, painted or etched or otherwise applied in large, precise characters, was a symbol set. A script. A language they did not recognize but clearly a language. And beneath it, what appeared to be a second line in a different notation, smaller and accompanied by what might have been a flag. The Conclave's linguistic database contained over 400 known languages. None of them matched. "There are words on the hull," Rathlin said quietly. "They labeled it." "Every vessel in the Conclave does that," Sethvar said. "Ship name, registry number, home port." "Yes." Rathlin stared at the characters on the screen. "But those labels are for other ships that can read them. They are a form of identity and communication." He looked around the council. "This vessel that refuses to answer our hails, that coats itself in scan-resistant materials, that travels dark and silent through our shipping corridor, it still wanted someone to know its name." The council sat with that for a moment. "There's something else," Irith Soul said. She brought up a separate data window. "During the active scan at the moment of peak array output, we detected a brief internal power surge aboard the target vessel. Contained. Non-threatening. But measured. They detected our scan," Aveth said. "More than detected it. Something aboard their ship responded to it, an automated system I suspect. It took a reading of our scan pulse." Sethvar's voice was flat. "They scanned our scan. A passive counterintelligence measure most likely. Standard on a vessel that routinely operates in contested or surveillance-heavy environments." Irith Soul folded her primary hands on the console. "They did not react aggressively. They simply recorded us. As if taking a reading of who was looking at them was already part of the mission protocol." Aveth stared at the partial ghost image of the dark ship on his display. A vessel traveling in deliberate silence, armored against detection, crewed by an unknown species, labeled in an unknown language, and equipped with systems designed not merely to avoid being scanned, but to gather intelligence on anyone who tried. "Relay the full scan package to the Conclave Defense Assembly," he said. "Priority 1. And include this in the summary header. This vessel is not lost. It is not adrift. It knows exactly where it is, exactly what we are, and it is allowing us to observe it." He paused. "I want to know why." The Conclave Science Directorate received the scan package from the Kethvaran survey fleet at 9:14 Standard Time and immediately forwarded it to 6 separate analysis divisions simultaneously: hull materials, propulsion classification, biological survey, linguistic cryptography, tactical assessment, and what the bureaucracy formally called the Historical and Pre-Contact Anomaly Registry. The first 5 divisions produced reports within 48 hours. Most of those reports contain the same foundational sentence in different forms. The data is insufficient for confident classification. The 6th division took 11 days. When their report arrived, it was flagged at the highest security tier. The analysis team's lead researcher, a senior archivist named Thesaurical of the Mendari species, had included a personal addendum that was unusual enough to be quoted in full when the report was briefed to the Defense Assembly. It read, "Before I present these findings, I want to note that I have been employed by the Conclave Historical Registry for 31 years. In that time I have reviewed approximately 4,000 anomaly reports. I have never before requested that my findings be presented to the Defense Assembly in person rather than by relay. I'm requesting it now." She got her audience. The Assembly Chamber on Conclave Central was built for 212 senior representatives. For this briefing, it held 11, the senior members of the Defense, Science and Diplomatic Councils, plus Fleet Commander Aveth himself, who had traveled from the Outer Spiral specifically to attend. Thesaurical was a small figure at the presentation podium, but she spoke without hesitation. 94 years ago, she began, a Mendari long-range exploration probe operating in the intermiddle arm detected a series of high-frequency electromagnetic signals from a previously uncharted star system. The signals were clearly artificial, modulated, patterned, and too complex for natural phenomena. They were logged, flagged as a Category 3 anomaly, potential pre-conclave civilization, and referred to the Historical Registry for monitoring. She pulled up a star chart. A single system was highlighted in the inner middle arm, unremarkable, a G-type star with a handful of planetary bodies. Over the following 40 years, we monitored that system passively. The signals became more complex, then branched across multiple frequencies, then eventually began to reach into the radio spectrum with structured mathematical content. Standard indicators of a developing technological civilization. She paused. We did not make contact. The system was outside our active expansion zone. The civilization appeared pre-space flight. Conclave protocol indicated passive monitoring and deferred contact, pending their own independent development of faster-than-light capability. Standard procedure, said one of the assembly members. Standard procedure, Thesaurical agreed. 31 years ago the signals from that system stopped. All frequencies. All bands. Simultaneously. She let that land. We assumed catastrophe. Natural or otherwise. The monitoring file was reclassified as extinct candidate and placed in long-term storage. Aveth, who had listened in silence until now, leaned forward slightly. But it wasn't extinct. No. Thesaurical brought up a new display, a side-by-side comparison. On the left was a hull composition analysis from the monitoring probe's 40-year observation record. On the right was Iritsol's scan data from the dark ship. When I cross-referenced the biological signature of the vessel's crew against the physiological data collected by our probe during its monitoring period, atmospheric composition, thermal preference, gravity standard, biological emission spectrum, I found a mash. Not approximate. Not probable. She looked around the chamber. The species crewing the vessel that entered our transit corridor is the same species we spent 40 years monitoring in silence. The civilization we classified as extinct 31 years ago did not die. She zoomed the display to the hull characters, the unknown script, the unreadable flag. They went quiet. And then they built that. The chamber was very still. In 31 years, said Defense Council Chair Mevental slowly, they went from a civilization we couldn't justify contacting because they hadn't mastered spaceflight, to operating a vessel that our best scanner array cannot fully penetrate. In 31 years of silence, Thesaurical confirmed. No interstellar transmissions we detected. No FTL signatures we recorded entering or leaving their system. Nothing. And then a warship, because that is what it is, I am not going to soften that assessment, appears in our transit corridor, traveling in deliberate silence, responding to first contact protocol with the mathematical minimum required to confirm intelligence, and making no other communication. Diplomatic Council Senior Arbiter Shinvor spoke carefully. Could the silence have been deliberate? Could they have detected our monitoring? Thesaurical had clearly anticipated this question. I believe so, yes. The timing of the transmission cessation coincides with an upgrade to our outer spiral probe network. An upgrade that temporarily increased our monitoring probe's emission signature before it was corrected. It is possible, I would say probable, that they detected the probe. She closed her notes. They knew we were watching. They went quiet. And they have been developing ever since, in silence, without giving us any data on their progress. Until now, Aveth said. Until now. When they chose to appear. The Defense Assembly absorbed this. A civilization that had detected alien surveillance, deliberately gone dark, spent 3 decades developing in silence, and then sent a warship into a major conclave shipping corridor, not attacking, not hiding, just being there, with a hull designed to be difficult to read and a communication protocol that said, I know you're there, I acknowledge your intelligence, and I'm not going to tell you anything else yet. Chair Mevental asked the question the whole room was thinking. What do they want? Thesaurical gathered her materials with the methodical care of someone who had spent 31 years with ancient records. I am an archivist, not a diplomat. But in my professional opinion, based on everything in this file, they are not here to threaten us. If they wanted to threaten us, they would have come with more than one ship. And they would not have announced their presence with a mathematical prime. She paused at the door. They are here to be seen. The question is what they want us to see. The ship's name, as best the Conclave's linguistic cryptographers could render it in Conclave standard, was UNSC Carthage. The letters, UNSC, took 3 weeks to decode through comparative mathematical linguistics. When the translation team finally cracked the organizational prefix, the full rendering read, United Nations Space Command, Heavy Cruiser, Designation, Carthage. The word Carthage resisted translation. The cryptographers eventually determined it was a proper noun, a historical reference from within the crew's own cultural archive. Its emotional valence was dense and contested. The machine translation offered 3 possibilities: a great city destroyed, a warning from history, or simply something that should not have been lost. The Conclave found all 3 interpretations unsettling in different ways. What they understood far better was the designation Heavy Cruiser. That, at least, required no translation. Every spacefaring civilization in the Conclave understood what a heavy cruiser was. It was not a science vessel. It was not an explorer. It was a ship built to fight, survive, and fight again. The deliberate intermediate class between a fast escort and a capital ship, designed to operate independently in hostile environments, absorb significant damage and continue its mission. Whatever mission that was. 3 months after the initial contact, the Conclave Defense Assembly authorized a formal diplomatic approach. Not a hail, not another mathematical ping. A dedicated diplomatic vessel, the Corda Leth, staffed with a full first contact team and equipped with the Conclave's most complete translation database, was dispatched to the Carthage's current position with orders to request a face-to-face negotiation. The Carthage accepted. Immediately on the first hail. The brevity of that acceptance was itself noted by every analyst in the Conclave intelligence apparatus. The humans, as the cryptographers had tentatively rendered their self-designation, had been waiting for a formal approach. They had known the mathematical acknowledgement was insufficient for a genuine conversation. They had been patient. Senior diplomatic arbiter Shinvor led the contact delegation. What she learned over the next 6 days changed every assumption the Conclave had built into its intelligence assessment. The humans came to the table with 3 representatives. Their ranking officer was a woman of middle age by human standards, compact, precise in movement, with the controlled stillness of someone who had spent a long time in confined environments. She introduced herself as Captain Elena Vasquez of the United Nations Space Command, and she spoke with the careful, measured diction of someone who had spent years preparing for this exact conversation. She confirmed what Thesaurical had theorized. They had detected the Conclave monitoring probe. Not immediately. The detection had taken 11 years and was eventually accomplished by a team of physicists studying anomalous background radiation in their outer system. By then, the scientific community had understood the implications. They were being watched by something with interstellar reach. The political response had been, by human standards, remarkably unified. We made a collective decision, Vasquez said, through the translation system her crew had prepared, a system that proved more sophisticated than anything the Conclave's first contact team had expected. We had no way of knowing whether you were friendly, neutral, or a threat. We had no diplomatic framework for engaging in interstellar civilization. And we had no capacity to defend ourselves if the answer was the wrong one. She folded her hands on the table. So we prioritized the last point. For 31 years, humanity had not gone to space in the visible, broadcasting way they had before. They had gone to space quietly, building infrastructure their interstellar neighbor could not easily detect. No large electromagnetic emissions. No high-power FTL signatures. No beacon transmissions. They had worked in the suppressed frequencies, with low observable technology, developing capabilities in the deliberate knowledge that a civilization capable of placing a probe in their outer system was almost certainly capable of reading their progress if they advertised it. "You spent 30 years preparing for us," said Shinvor. "Preparing for the possibility of you, yes." Vasquez was precise about the distinction. "We didn't know what you were. We still don't know everything about what you are. But we knew something was out there. Something that had found us before we could find it." She looked at the conclave representatives steadily. "We decided that when we finally came to that conversation, we didn't want to arrive empty-handed. The Carthage," Vasquez explained, "was not an anomaly. It was not a prototype or an experiment. It was a routine deployment. The United Nations Space Command maintained a standing fleet in the outer solar approaches, vessels that operated on rotation, crewed by professional military personnel, maintaining presence in the deep space perimeter that humanity had quietly extended over 3 decades. The Carthage had entered conclave space. They had identified it as organized, administered space based on the regularity of shipping traffic and navigation beacons, because it was time. "Time for what?" asked Shinvor. "Time to stop letting you find us on your schedule." There was no aggression in Vasquez's voice. Only the calm precision of someone stating an obvious strategic truth. "You've known where we are for at least 11 years by your own probe's detection date. Possibly longer. We've known something was out there for roughly the same period. The information asymmetry was always going to resolve eventually. Pause. We decided to resolve it ourselves." Shinvor asked carefully about the Carthage's hull composition. "About the scan resistance." Vasquez nodded as if she'd been expecting the question. "The conclave scan your fleet conducted was recorded. We have a complete profile of your active array's capabilities." She said this without apology or emphasis. "In the same way, I assume that you now have a partial profile of what our hull defeats." She let the mutual acknowledgement of that intelligence exchange sit between them for a moment. "We came here in a warship," Vasquez said, "because we wanted to be honest about what we are. We are a civilization that built a defense architecture before we built a diplomatic one. We made that choice knowingly. We're not apologizing for it." She leaned forward slightly. "But we are here. At a table. Talking. Because that is also what we are." Shinvor would write in her mission debrief that she had conducted first contact negotiations with 11 species over a 40-year career. This was the first time she had ever felt that the species across the table had prepared more thoroughly than she had. The diplomatic exchange between the conclave delegation and the crew of the Carthage had been underway for 6 days when conclave intelligence analysis, operating independently of the diplomatic channel as protocol required, delivered a secondary assessment to the Defense Assembly. It was classified above Standard Council clearance. The lead analyst, a veteran intelligence officer named Veth Soreth, had built her career on a particular methodology. She never analyzed what a subject said. She analyzed what a subject didn't say, what a subject didn't do, and what questions a subject answered too smoothly enough that the answer had clearly been prepared, rehearsed, and deliberately limited. The Carthage's Captain Vasquez had answered every question she'd been asked. She had been cooperative, clear, and precise. She had confirmed the detection of the probe. She had explained the decision to develop quietly. She had described the UNSC's mission architecture and the Carthage's deployment role. She had voluntarily provided an overview of human political structure, the approximate population of their home system, and the general parameters of their interstellar capability. What she had not answered was every question that hadn't been asked. And the questions that hadn't been asked were, Veth Soreth argued, more important than the ones that had. Her analysis ran to 42 pages. The Defense Assembly received a 6-page summary. The critical points were these. Vasquez had described the Carthage as a routine deployment. The word routine in this context was doing significant work. A routine deployment implied a rotation cycle. A rotation cycle implied multiple vessels capable of filling the same role. A vessel capable of operating alone in conclave space for an extended period, with the range, endurance, and self-sufficiency to travel from the human home system to the outer spiral arm and back, was a substantial capability investment. If that was routine, then the non-routine capability was something else entirely. Vasquez had also described a standing fleet in the outer solar approaches. Not a single patrol vessel. Not an experimental program. A fleet, standing, a term that implied permanent establishment, organized command structure, defined operational zones. She told us they have a defense fleet, Vethsorith briefed to the assembly, and that the Carthage is part of it. She did not tell us how large that fleet is. She did not tell us its full operational range. She did not tell us whether the fleet that defends their inner system, because there is almost certainly a separate capability for that, is different from the fleet that operates in deep space. She set down her notes. And we did not ask. Because we were still operating under the assumption that we were meeting a young civilization making its first tentative contact. We were wrong about that assumption, said Defense Chair Mevental. We were wrong about everything about that assumption, Vethsorith confirmed. They are not making a tentative first contact. They are making a deliberate, prepared, and strategically timed first contact. The Carthage is not a messenger vessel. It is a demonstration. The assembly absorbed this in silence. A demonstration of what, specifically? Asked Mevental. Of competence. Of restraint. Of capability paired with intent. Vethsorith pulled up a tactical analysis. Consider what they chose to demonstrate and what they chose to withhold. They let our scanner array attempt a full read and did not interfere. They allowed us to see that our array was insufficient. That was the demonstration. But they did not reveal what our array missed. That was the withholding. They confirmed they have a military fleet but provided no order of battle data. They confirmed 30 years of development but provided no specific technological catalog. She looked at the assembly. Every piece of information they gave us was real. Every piece of information they withheld was also real. And the line between the two was drawn with great care. Fleet Commander Aveth, attending by relay from the outer spiral, spoke for the first time in the briefing. What you're describing is a species that understands information management at a sophisticated strategic level. I'm describing a species that spent 30 years practicing it, Vethsorith said. They developed their military capability in silence specifically because they understood that capability, once visible, becomes a bargaining position. They are now at the table. They are revealing their capability selectively, in a controlled manner, to establish a negotiating baseline without showing their ceiling. One of the diplomatic council members, not Shinvor, who was still aboard the contact vessel, objected to this framing. You're describing this as if it were adversarial. What if it simply reflects a prudent, security-conscious civilization making reasonable choices? Those two things are not mutually exclusive, Vethsorith said, with the patience of someone who had already anticipated the objection. A prudent, security-conscious civilization that makes reasonable strategic choices is an adversary if you ever come into conflict with it. That is precisely what makes it worth taking seriously. She closed her analysis. I am not arguing they are hostile. I am arguing they are prepared. There is a significant difference, and understanding that difference determines how we approach this relationship going forward. The Defense Assembly voted that same day to formally request a full diplomatic exchange, including a mutual inspection arrangement, each side to provide a limited tour of their respective vessels. The humans accepted within 12 hours. The conclave inspection team that boarded the Carthage 3 days later consisted of 6 members. They were shown 3 decks, the bridge, the main propulsion compartment, and the medical bay. Their conclave standard scan devices, which they had been permitted to carry, recorded everything visible. The tour lasted 4 hours. When the inspection team returned to their own vessel, the senior technical officer sat down in the debriefing room and stared at the wall for a long time before he spoke. They have been doing this longer than 30 years, he said. Explain, said Vethsorith, who had joined the debriefing remotely. The design philosophy. The construction techniques. The material science evident in what we could see. He shook his head. Some of this took decades of iterative development before the version we saw was possible. The version we saw was not the first version. It was not even close to the first version. He looked at his notes. They went quiet 31 years ago. But they had been moving toward this long before that. Vethsorith said nothing for a moment. Then, they didn't start building a defense in response to detecting our probe. No, the technical officer said. I don't think they did. They had already started. Yes. I think when they detected the probe they simply accelerated. The room was quiet. Somewhere across 8,000 kilometers of vacuum, the Carthage sat in the dark, patient and enormous, waiting for the next phase of a conversation its crew had clearly been preparing for longer than any of them had previously understood. The full analysis of the Carthage's active scan data took 6 months. Not because the data was sparse, it was, in relative terms, a limited return from a scan that had defeated much of what the Kethvaran array had thrown at it. It took 6 months because the conclave's scientific establishment kept arriving at conclusions that required verification, and verification kept producing the same conclusions. The peer review process in this case was less an exercise in academic rigor than a collective attempt to confirm that someone hadn't made an arithmetic error. No one had. The formal findings were presented to the Joint Science and Defense Assembly by Dr. Pethvallen, chair of the Conclave Materials Research Institute, a species called the Varith who were generally considered the most technically sophisticated civilization in the conclave's membership. Pethvallen had spent 40 years studying advanced propulsion materials, exotic hull composites, and high-energy physics. She had won the conclave's highest scientific honor twice. She began her presentation by saying that some of her findings were going to be difficult to receive and that she wanted the assembly to understand she had spent 3 months attempting to find an alternative explanation before concluding that no alternative explanation existed. The first finding was the hull composition. The scan-resistant coating on the Carthage's hull was in isolation, not revolutionary. The conclave had several member species capable of producing electromagnetic scatter materials. What was remarkable was the layering, the precise, frequency-specific arrangement of different material properties that had caused the Kethvaran scanner array to receive fragmented, inconsistent returns rather than clean scatter, which would have been easily processed. The technical term for what the human engineers had done was adaptive electromagnetic stratification. It was a theoretical concept the conclave's materials science community had published papers on for approximately 60 years without producing a working implementation, because the manufacturing tolerances required were considered practically unachievable with conventional fabrication methods. The reason we believed it was unachievable, Pethvallen said carefully, was that we were modeling the fabrication process on our own manufacturing systems. The humans appear to have solved the tolerance problem through a different fabrication approach, one we can partially reverse engineer from the scatter data but cannot yet replicate. She advanced her slide. This is not the work of a civilization that stumbled into advanced manufacturing. This is the work of a civilization that pursued a specific technical goal with sustained institutional commitment over a long period. The second finding was the power signature, the anomalous energy profile that Earithsol had flagged on first contact and that had resisted classification for 6 months. It was not an anomaly. It was a known energy signature. The conclave's physics community had a theoretical model for it. A paper published 37 years ago by a research team at the Mendari Institute of Advanced Physics, proposing a new approach to compact high-density energy storage that could, in theory, produce exactly the power profile the Kethvaran sensors had recorded. The paper had been cited 11 times since publication. It was considered an interesting theoretical contribution with no near-term practical application, because the engineering pathway from the theory to a working implementation was considered prohibitively complex. 11 citations in 37 years, said Defense Chair Mevental, reading the footnote in the report. Yes, said Pethvallen. It appears the humans may have read it. A member of the Science Council asked whether there was any possibility this was coincidence, that the humans had independently developed the same technology without access to the conclave paper. There is always that possibility, Pethvallen said. But the human civilization detected our monitoring probe 11 years ago. They almost certainly identified the probe's origin point as related to an organized civilization. If that civilization's scientific publications were detectable through the probe's relay frequencies, which they may have been, the probe transmitted on standard conclave bands, then access to the conclave's open scientific archive was theoretically possible. They may have been reading our research journals for over a decade, Mevental said. And not publishing anything themselves, yes. Pethvallen closed her technical notes. I want to be clear about what the total picture of this analysis suggests. A civilization that detects alien surveillance, goes electromagnetically quiet, accesses whatever information is available through the surveillance channel, and then applies that information selectively to develop specific capabilities, that is not a reactive civilization. That is a civilization with a coherent, long-term strategic development program. She looked around the assembly. They found a paper in our archive about a theoretical power system. They built a working version of it and put it in a warship. Then they brought the warship to our shipping corridor and let our scanners record the power signature. She let the silence hold for a moment. They were not hiding the power signature. They were displaying it. Specifically, to anyone who had the scientific background to identify what they were seeing. A message, said Shinvor, who had returned from the diplomatic mission and was attending her first assembly session since coming home. A message, Pethvallen agreed. Not aggressive. Not threatening. But unambiguous, We read your work. We built on it. We have been paying attention. And the corollary that follows from that, do not assume you know the ceiling of what we can do, because you cannot see how far we have already gone. Defense Chair Mevental was quiet for a long time. What is your recommendation to the Assembly? He asked finally. Pethvalen was a scientist. She had spent her career studying materials and energy physics. She had no diplomatic training, no strategic background, no role in the conclave's security architecture. She answered anyway. Treat them as an equal, she said. Not as a client civilization. Not as a recently contacted species navigating their way into the conclave framework. As a peer with capabilities we do not fully understand and a strategic intelligence we have consistently underestimated. She paused. And perhaps most importantly, find out what they want. Not what they say they want at the diplomatic table. What they actually want. Because they have been building towards something for a very long time, and I do not believe a first meeting in a shipping corridor is the destination. She closed her materials. I believe it is the introduction. The formal diplomatic summit between the Conclave and the United Nations Space Command was held 4 months after Pethvalen's address to the Assembly. Neutral ground, by mutual agreement, was defined as deep space, a point equidistant between the human home system and the nearest Conclave station, chosen by a joint navigation committee as having no strategic value to either party. 3 Conclave vessels. 3 human vessels. The Conclave brought the Corda Leth, the diplomatic cruiser that had conducted the initial exchange, accompanied by 2 escort ships. The UNSC sent the Carthage, which had by this point become something of a symbol in its own right, the ship that had started everything, accompanied by 2 vessels the Conclave had never seen before. They were not heavy cruisers. Conclave tactical assessment had approximately 40 seconds between the FTL arrival of the human formation and the beginning of the diplomatic protocols to record initial observations on the 2 escort vessels. Those observations were brief, professional, and highlighted in every intelligence debrief that followed. The escort vessels were larger than the Carthage. Significantly. They carried the same hull treatment, the scan-resistant coating that had been the subject of 6 months of Conclave materials research. Their drive signatures were clean and powerful. Their running posture was passive and non-threatening. But there was nothing about them that suggested they had been built for anything other than exactly what they appeared to be. The human delegation brought warships to the peace table. Not as a threat. As a statement of honest identity. Shinvor, leading the Conclave delegation for the second time, noted this in her opening remarks, carefully, diplomatically, but directly. I want to acknowledge what you have brought to this meeting, and what we have brought to this meeting, and what both of those things say about how we intend to engage with each other. Captain Vasquez was not the senior representative at the summit. She was present, the Carthage was her ship, but the UNSC had sent a diplomat for the formal exchange. His name was Marcus Adeyemi, and he carried the title Special Envoy of the United Nations Security Council. He was a tall, quiet man who listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke, he chose his words with the economy of someone who had learned that precision mattered more than volume. He responded to Shinvor's acknowledgement simply. We brought warships because we are a species that builds warships. We thought it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. He folded his hands on the table. We are also a species that builds hospitals and schools and research stations and cities. We thought you should know the full picture. What followed was 11 days of negotiations. The formal record of those negotiations ran to 400 pages in Conclave standard transcript, and the full text was eventually published to the Conclave's open archive, a decision that was itself notable, given that first contact negotiations were typically classified for a minimum of 50 years. The decision to publish was mutual. Both sides had agreed on it in advance. The summary of what was agreed and what was understood was considerably shorter than 400 pages. The humans wanted 3 things. The first was straightforward: formal recognition as a sovereign civilization with the full protections of Conclave territory law. This was not a request for membership, they were specific about that. It was a request not to be treated as a client, a protectorate, or an uncatalogued anomaly. They had existed as an organized civilization longer than several current Conclave member species. They wanted their sovereignty acknowledged before anything else was discussed. The Conclave granted this on the 3rd day. The second was more complex, a mutual security framework. Not an alliance, which implied entanglement and obligation. A framework, a set of agreed protocols for what happened when both civilizations encountered each other in space, when their interests overlapped or conflicted, and when a genuine threat to either party emerged that the other was positioned to assist with. You have been the dominant military power in this region of space for a long time, Adeyemi said during the session on this point. We are not challenging that. We are not positioning ourselves as a rival. But we are also not going to enter this relationship as a protected species. We have our own defense capability and we intend to maintain it. What we are offering is coordination, the knowledge that if something comes that neither of us anticipated, we are not strangers to each other. This negotiation took 4 days. The final framework was 60 pages and required annotation by both parties. The third thing was the one that had not been on anyone's initial prediction list. The humans wanted access to the Conclave Science Archive. Not selective access, not supervised access. Open access, the same access available to any Conclave member species or registered research institution. Every paper, every dataset, every theoretical model, every engineering study. In exchange they offered the same. The Conclave Science Council received this offer and spent 2 days in closed session before responding. When they responded, their answer was yes, but their reasoning was less about generosity than about the quiet recognition of something Pethvalen had pointed out 6 months earlier. The humans had already found at least one paper in the open access portion of the Conclave archive and built a working implementation of its theoretical framework. If they had found one, they had probably found more. Withholding access now would only slow the exchange, not prevent it. And given the trajectory of what they had produced in 30 years of silence, the more interesting question was not what the humans would gain from the Conclave archive. It was what the Conclave would gain from theirs. The science exchange agreement was signed on the 9th day. On the 11th and final day, as the summit concluded and the delegations prepared to return to their respective vessels, Shinvor found herself standing with Adeyemi at the observation port of the meeting station, looking out at the 6 ships arranged in the dark, 3 and 3, the Conclave's clean lines beside the Carthage's deliberate angularity. I want to ask you something directly, she said. Not for the record. Go ahead. The Carthage appearing in our transit corridor. The specific timing. The specific way it was done. She looked at him. You wanted us to find the power signature. You wanted us to run the analysis. You knew we would eventually trace it back to a Conclave research paper. Adeyemi looked at the ships in the dark for a moment. We wanted you to understand, he said, that we had not spent 30 years isolated. We had been paying attention. We had been learning. And we wanted you to understand that before you decided what kind of civilization you were meeting. He paused. The first impression of a new relationship tends to stick. We wanted ours to be accurate. Shinvor considered this. You wanted us to come to this table with correct assumptions. We wanted to come to this table without being underestimated. He glanced at her sideways. Those aren't quite the same thing. Outside, the Carthage sat in the dark between the stars, neither threatening nor deferential, precisely what it had always been, exactly what it had always intended to show the universe it was. A warship, yes. But also, the opening line of a sentence that had taken 30 years to write, delivered to an audience of 11 Conclave vessels and eventually an entire interstellar civilization that had watched a dark hull cross their shipping corridor and wondered, for 6 months, what lived inside it. The answer, it turned out, was not what they had feared and not what they had hoped and not what they had predicted. The answer was something they had not, in 1200 years of expansion and contact and diplomacy, encountered before. A civilization that had known it was being watched, had chosen to be silent, had chosen to prepare, and had then chosen, deliberately on its own schedule in its own way, to say, here we are. We have been here the whole time. And we are ready to talk.